My name is David Gardiner. It's great to be with you all this evening. I'm a senior developer for 6pivot, Microsoft MVP, and I help organise the Adelaide.NET user group. Anyway, on with funky Azure Functions. So first of all, before we go too far, I think it's worth just saying, well, what's the point of Azure Functions? What are they anyway? Why do we care? So they're really a way of responding to events with custom logic. So they're Azure's serverless offering, if you like. I guess a couple of the key things about Azure Functions is that they're good at really good at scaling to demand. So if you've got a massive increase in demand suddenly, then they can just scale up really quickly. They support multiple languages. So I'll be focusing on the .NET stack this evening, but they also support other languages like Java, Python, TypeScript. There's probably another one as well. Yeah, so there's a few different options for languages there, and there's some different pricing and feature plans, but I won't dwell on that too much other than to say that there's different options there, and if you need extra features, you can pay for them. If you don't, then you don't need to. So that's just to be aware of. So Azure Functions themselves, going back, I guess, to the current offering, before we jump into .NET 5 or .NET 6, it's worth just understanding what we get with .NET 3.1. So an Azure Function is a class library that we've written, and it's running within the context of an Azure Function host. That's all running in the same process. So we'll just quickly jump in and show, if we're going to create an Azure Function, how would we do that? So first of all, we can go to Visual Studio, and I'll just bring up my terminal, and I'm going to launch Visual Studio 22 preview because I like to live on the edge. So I could go create new project and search for functions. Because I've selected the Azure workload when I set up Visual Studio, I've got Azure Functions there. And yeah, that's fine. And .NET 3, and in fact, there's a whole lot of other things I could add as far as triggers to go to add into that project. So I could do it that way. I could go to the portal, and so within Azure, I can go to create and search for functions, and function app, click on create, it's good to know, and give it a name, choose .NET, there's the other languages, which one did I forget? PowerShell, how could I forget PowerShell? 3.1 region, and away we go, and I could create a function that way too. But you don't want to see me do all that. All right, so let's open up a project I prepared before. And so I've got a .NET 3.1 Azure function here, and we'll just step through a few things just so we can then contrast the 3.1 Azure function with 5 and 6 later on. So I've got a HTTP trigger here. We can do a get or a post. It's returning an iAction result. It's bringing in a HTTP request. And if I press F5, well, actually, it'll build this and it'll run it locally. And it's using basically running the host locally and using the Azure Function core tools to do that. So now it's launched the core tools host, and I can grab the endpoint there, just copy that, and let's bring up my browser window, paste that in, and there's our output there. So I've just hit that endpoint, and we'll see there was some logging there around that as well. All right, so that's that. The other thing we can, so that was a static class. We can also do a regular class where we've got a basic dependency injection where we're defining what requirements this class needs as far as logging, or it's using HTTP client. This example is going off to another web service and querying that for weather data. And deserializing that and just displaying out the information there. We could listen to a service bus queue. So we've got a trigger here that's based on messages that are getting posted to a queue or a topic. When I first set up this demo, I created a service bus with a queue, and I thought, what do I name the queue? And I thought I'll call it Cumber, because it was going to be a cucumber. But then a bit later on, I realized I needed multiple listeners to that message queue. So a queue wasn't so good. A topic was going to be better. So my topic is now called of conversation. So yeah, we have a startup class here where we can just register. If we do have some other things, we can hook into the builder and add in our HTTP client dependency there. Likewise, we could jump in and say we want to extend the way that we configure our function. So yeah, we've got a few different, there's a whole lot of other different triggers as well, but I won't show them now. Just to show you that's the current state with 3.1, and then we'll contrast that a bit later. So, but what can go wrong? What's the problem with that particular model? Well, one of them is assembly conflicts, and I'll show that if I jump back to Visual Studio. So in our injected trigger, I'll just run this just so we can see what it does. So you know it does work. I'll just grab the other endpoint there and paste that in. And so that should go off. And it goes off and queries out of the web service and just returns back the name of the location where the weather data relates to. So I'm based in Adelaide, so it's telling me that the name is Adelaide. So that's all working. In this particular project, I've added a reference to newtonsoft.json version 13. And I'm just going to uncomment this code here, which uses a feature of that new version of json.net, essentially. So I'll press F5 again. Builds and runs, and so we didn't get any compilation errors. It's all working correctly. Wait for those endpoints to appear. I'll go back to my browser again and just press F5, and I don't get any output. But in fact, if I go back here, I've got an error. I can even zoom in. No, I can't. But anyway, there's the problem there. I've got version 13 reference, but it's still trying to load version 12. The reason for that is that because we're running the same process, we have to work with whatever assemblies have already been loaded by Azure Functions. And Azure Functions, it turns out, the host also depends on newtonsoft.json. So even though I've got in my project file a reference to 1301, it's too bad, because if you're in the one process, you can't load a second version of an assembly. So we're kind of stuck. So that's a bit of a problem. So what can we do about that? Well, in .NET 5 for Azure Functions, they've introduced a new way of working, which is isolated mode. So they've separated out the Azure Functions host from the worker process. And so we've now got our, what essentially is a .NET 5 executable running inside the worker process on the right, and that's separate from the host. So we're not going to be running into version conflicts with assemblies that are different to what the host has to what we want. So that's a nice step forward. So how do we create a .NET 5 Azure function? Well, let's try the portal. Let's go back to our browser again, because we saw how we could create functions there. We're already on that screen, .NET 5, and no, we can't actually. So you can't create a function app through the portal at the moment, through the UI. So that's a problem. We can, however, create it a few other ways. We can create it from the command line, or we can create it in Visual Studio. So just like we saw, we can go File, New Project, search for functions, and choose .NET 5, and we've got still got a whole lot of triggers there. You may have noticed that list changed a little bit though. So just to point out that if I go from, whoops, not 2, 3, I I've got a whole lot of stuff there. I don't know how many there are, but if I jump down to 5, there are less options. So not everything in the UI at least is supported, but some of these things, and I'll call it out, particularly something like a durable function. You'll see that under .NET 3. You won't see that under .NET 5 because it's actually not supported. So we could certainly do that and create a new project that way. That will work. You can also do the same thing in VS Code, and likewise we can deploy. We'll cover deployment a bit later on. So let's have a look at the other differences. So I've got some projects I created earlier. So here's our .NET 5 Azure function. Have a look at our HTTP trigger, and there are some differences here. So first of all, we'll notice the signature of this method, which is our Azure function, is now returning a HTTP response data. If you remember, the 3.1 was returning an async result. And also it's passing in a HTTP request data. And I'll just jump back here, we'll just show you again, instead of a HTTP request. So it's a different type. So some of the types have changed. And likewise, if I have a look at the service bus trigger, back in 3.1, we can either pass in a string or there's a type called message that we can take in here as a parameter. Over here, I've got a string. If I try and type in message, it doesn't work and it can't resolve it. I can do a control dot and it says, I've got no idea what you're talking about. However, there is a type called service bus received message, and that will work. So that type has also changed. The other difference is that because we're now creating a program, like an application, we've got a program class and a static void main in there. So rather than just a startup class that inherits from base class, this is a fully fledged executable. And so if you've done any particularly sort of ASP.NET Core development, this sort of pattern is going to look very familiar. We've got our host builder. We can add our extra, any other sort of middleware that we want to add in here, just in a similar way to what we would have done with other kinds of applications. So that's a nicer way of working, I think, a bit more familiar. So yeah, so it's a different way of working, but does enable us to use .NET 5. So yeah, the other nice thing is we're using .NET 5 so we can use C#9. So if there's language features that in C#9, we can use those now, which is kind of nice. Are there any problems? Well, there are some, as far as we've seen the change of signatures, particularly for service bus triggers. So if you've got a 3.1 function, it's probably not just a simple change the target and recompile. There's probably going to be some breaking changes if you wanted to do that. I've also flagged no durable functions. The other thing to be aware of is that because of those types changing, there might be some third-party libraries that you are wanting to use with your functions that may not work. So, for example, when I was looking at using .NET 5 Azure Functions early this year, we were wanting to use mass transit with that. And because mass transit had been written against the message type, that didn't work. I think that has changed now. I think there's a new library that's come out, but there could be some other libraries as well in a similar situation. And we've also seen the limited support in Azure Portal. If you publish an Azure function, .NET 5 Azure function, you will see it in the portal, but it's also a bit restricted. So I'll just jump back and show you that now. For one that I have created already. That's fine. So here's a .NET 5 Azure function. And we'll be able to drill in. And essentially when I drill in here, we're seeing that basically you can't do much more than this. And if it was a 3.1 function, I could go in and actually test out the endpoint in here. But that's disabled. We don't even get access to that. So the support within the portal is very limited. Okay, so that's .NET 5. What about .NET 6? Well, it's really just building on what .NET 5 has done already. It is in preview at the moment. So .NET itself .NET 6 will be launched in November. That's sort of been publicly announced, and so I believe the plan is that .NET 6 Azure Functions will sort of be coming out around the same time. You can start playing with the preview now. There's a preview out already. That does require a different version of the core tools, so it needs the version 4 preview. And there's a bit of a manual process to get those tools installed. There's a link there to a wiki page that they've got on. If you want to try out the version 6 stuff, this is what you need to go through to get those tools installed properly. The interesting thing is that the .NET 6 Azure Functions will support both the in-process and isolated. So the 3.1 model, where everything's running in the same memory process, or isolated like .NET 5. And so because it supports in-process, then the .NET 6 will be able to support durable functions. So if that was something you were using previously, then upgrading to .NET 6 is a possibility. So let's have a look at some .NET 6 Azure Functions to see how they compare. So first of all, we'll have a look at the code, and then I'll demonstrate them working. So we've got two .NET 6 Azure Functions. The first one is an in-process .NET 6 function. And so the trigger looks pretty much the same as the 3.1. We've got the action result, HTTP request. Just to prove it is .NET 6, I've thrown in some C#10 code here. I'm not actually using it, but just to prove that it compiles. And I could use those features if I wanted to. Likewise, the I'll do the trigger first. And the service bus queue trigger, that's basically the same as the 3.1 as well. If I jump over to the outer process, then I've got my program there. I've got my trigger using the HTTP response data and request data, and the service bus trigger. I could use that other type here. So basically, it's I could update my .NET 5 functions to 6 outer process, and my 3.1 I could upgrade to 6 in process. So that's a bit more flexible. So that's the code. I can't demo this though, because I've got the Core Tools 3 installed on Windows. But if you did want me to see me actually do it, what I've done is I've got WSL, Windows Subsystem for Linux, installed, and I've pulled in that code in there, and I've installed the Core Tools here. So one of the command line tools is called Func, and just to confirm, it is version 4. There it is. So I'll jump into the first one, the next 60 in process, and I'll do func start, which will launch. It'll basically build and then run the function locally. So there's that first trigger there. I'm just going to click on that and bring up my browser window. And so there's my, let's bring that down a bit. So my .NET 6 in process trigger has fired, so that's good. And I'll go over to the .NET 6, the outer process, and do the same thing again. Start that one up. And it's running. I'll just refresh this page because it's the same named endpoint. And there we go, we're out of process. So that one worked as well. Excellent. So what about the future? Well, where are we heading after this? So .NET 6 is coming out end of this year, around November. And that seems to be the same date they're targeting for Azure Functions. This is the public roadmap that they've published. And so after .NET 6, well, .NET 7. And so it's interesting that we've got this in process and isolated process, and there seems to be a bit of a convergence around the .NET 7, .NET 8 timescale. So .NET 7, I'm assuming that will come out probably November 2022, and .NET 8, November 2023, if they stick with the current schedule. So it sounds like they're sort of going to consolidate at some stage in the future, but I guess that is still like a couple of years away, so anything could happen between now and then. But yeah, it's good to know where things are heading in that respect. All right, so that's .NET 5 and 6 Azure Functions. We've got our function up and running. How about we add some OpenAPI support to our Azure Function? We can do that out of the box if we're using Visual Studio, creating a brand new project in 2022, or the latest versions of 2019, in fact. We can say, I want to create a new Azure Function project, and I can choose my HTTP trigger with OpenAPI. So there is that option there. But if we've already got an Azure Function project running, then we can add the Microsoft.azure.webjobs.extensions.openapi NuGet package, and that will enable us to add OpenAPI or Swagger support to our Azure Function. So let's have a look at what that might look like. So I've got on a different branch, and no, I don't want to save that. And what I've done, just to explain everything, is currently the version of that package that is available at nuget.org supports .NET 3.1 Azure Functions, and work is happening right now to support .NET 5 and .NET 6. So that will be the next version that's released. And I'm hoping that's going to come out really soon. So in order to be able to demo what's most likely going to be the version that you'd like to use, I've pulled down that source code for that package, built it all locally, and referenced that locally here. So just to let you know, if you go to NuGet now, you won't be able to get this working yet unless you did the same thing as what I did. Yeah, so I've added those package references there. And if we have a look at our Azure Function here, our function class, we've got some new attributes that we've added to our function. So we've got OpenAPI operation, and that's where we're able to define the name of the operation that this represents. We can give a summary and a description. We can also say for this endpoint or operation, what is the kind of body that we're expecting to pass into it? If it's a post, which it is in this case. So if it was a GET, we wouldn't expect to be able to pass a body to it. So it's a JSON type, and it's represented by this C# class. So let's have a look at that class. So this is the class that represents what we're expecting to be passed in as a body. And we've also got some attributes here. So we've got a name, an age, and a property called nullable string. And so we've got OpenAPI property where we can add a description. We can also indicate whether for Swagger or for the OpenAPI, whether a property is nullable or not. Now you might think, well, hang on, we've got the ability to specify nullable here with the question mark. The problem there is that they still need to be able to be backwards compatible with older versions of C#. So they couldn't rely on that language feature, so they've had to use the attribute instead. We can also provide some default values, and these will be revealed in the Swagger document, as well as making use of the data annotation attributes like max length or range to indicate what are the legal values. We've also got back up the top here, we've got OpenAPI example. And this mentions this other class, info request example, which inherits from a base class. And it's got a method, and what that does is it allows us to provide example data, sample data essentially, for our endpoint. So I've got an instance of my info request class, setting some property values there, and we'll see that in a moment. The other thing to note is that in our main class, we've added a configure OpenAPI method called there, extension method, just to wire everything up. So with that all in place, and if I make this my default startup project, I should be able to press F5. And it should build, and it should not hang. And we've now got some extra endpoints there. So I'm going to select the Swagger UI endpoint. I think I got that. It might have scrolled off my screen. There we go. Jump back to my browser, and let's go full screen on this one. And we then see what, if you've ever done any Swagger or OpenAPI before, you're probably familiar with this UI. Essentially, we've got our operation name that we define called demo. We've got our summary and our description there. Obviously, for a real implementation, we provide a more useful summary and description, but for a demo, this is fine. And here's our example data. So that's been populated here. So we can see what is a typical value that might appear here. And we can even try it out. So we click on the try out and it populates the data there with the example by default. That's not quite my age, but I'm sure there's someone who's 21 whose name's David around the place. And I can hit on execute and there's our response. Now, interesting to note that we've also documented what are the actual responses. So if we jump back to our code, and that's kind of annoying because I told that to go away. All right, and if I move that out the way, there we go, that's better. And yes, if I go back to here, we had a couple more attributes, which I forgot to mention earlier. We're also defining what is the standard response, so a 200 OK, and we're just expecting text. We've also said that we could get a 400, a bad request coming out of this method, so we've documented that. And usually, I guess you would hope that you would include a description to indicate why that might be happening. All right, well, that's good. We've got a nice UI there. Is there anything we can do to make that even better? Well, for one thing, we scroll back up the top there. This is Swagger version 2. That's the default that it builds. So what about if we wanted to build OpenAPI version 3? I sort of say Swagger and OpenAPI interchangeably. If I uncomment this class here, so I'm implementing the OpenAPI configuration options interface, and this lets me set a few properties, and so things like defining what is the version of this API that I've created. What do I want to call that? I don't want to call that version 1. Here's a title and a description, some contact details for me as the author. I can define a license if it was a public API. I can also set OpenAPI version. So rather than version 2, which is a default, I can say, no, I want version 3. So with that in place, I can press F5 and it'll build and run. And we'll reload this page and we'll see it updates a bit with some extra information. So there we go. So we've now got our description up here, our extra sort of metadata about the API. We can even drill into the Swagger itself and have a look at that. And we'll see how those attributes are coming through. So particularly, we've got our sort of responses, 200, 400, and we've got things like, here's our properties. We've got our max length coming through there, minimum, maximum, a default value. This property here is nullable. And there's our example data there. Now, just to highlight that, I'll just bring that up so it's more in the middle of the screen. This example, you might notice if you look closely, that's not actually JSON, it's a string. And so that's okay within the UI here, but if you're using this Swagger in another tool like Postman or something like that, that it's kind of annoying because it comes through as a string. It means you have to go in, and if you want to use that, you've got to remove all the escapes to turn it back into proper JSON. The reason that is the way it is because the functions OpenAPI library depends on another library, and that library doesn't implement examples quite yet. So hopefully at some stage that will be fixed, and then this problem will go away. But just something to be aware of, that when you pull that example in, you will need to edit that, or you could just copy the text from this page, and that'll work okay too. So just something to be aware of about that. But otherwise, this is really nice OpenAPI Swagger document. You could use this to generate a client proxy, and you've got all this extra metadata so that you'll be able to be confident that yes, this field should allow nulls, but all the others shouldn't, for example, and have that sort of validation there, which is really useful. So we saw it, sort of adding that package reference and making use of all those attributes will sort of enhance the swagger that's being generated. All right, so we've got our function, we've added OpenAPI support. How do we deploy our function? So I'll have a look at a couple of different ways. First of all, Azure Pipelines and then GitHub Actions. So first of all, let's have a look at the source code. I'll jump back to here and bring up VS Code. And so first of all, Azure Pipelines. And so we've got a pipeline here that I've written. We've got a couple of stages. We've got a build and a deploy stage. So I guess the main things here, this is running on a Windows agent, but because we're building .NET 3.1, .NET 5, and .NET 6, I've had to install all 3 SDKs. Now, if I was only building .NET 5 Azure Functions, I would still need to install the .NET 3.1 SDK, just because there is a dependency that there are some things in the 3.1 SDK that are required to build Azure Functions, even if you're building .NET 5. And I've got the .NET 6 one here as well. And then using .NET Publish to build everything. And then for the pipelines, I've only done 2 of the function projects. We'll see all 4 in the GitHub Actions. I'm just zipping up the publish directories and storing those as build artifacts. Then in deploy stage, those artifacts get pulled down automatically. And then I'm calling the Azure Function app task, and that's pushing up that zip file to Azure, and that's all you need to do to publish your function up into Azure. Quite straightforward. I've just supplied the subscription information there. The pipelines, it does have a service connection already configured, so that is the subscription. So that's created in Azure there, or in pipelines. And if I jump over to my link there, we'll see that this has been deployed a little while ago. I've got the 2 stages there, and the deploy stage, you'll see it's taking around about a little bit over 30 seconds per function to deploy each one. So yeah, that all worked pretty well. Okay, so the next one is deploying from GitHub Actions. So jump back to VS Code. Oops. And you'll see that GitHub Actions is rather similar to Azure Pipelines. And what do you know? Somebody wrote a blog post that was rather useful. So do have a look at that if you're wanting to do GitHub Actions. And if you've got any questions, well, I think you'll be able to get in contact with him pretty easily. But yeah, so a similar kind of process here. We're making sure we've got all the SDKs installed, the 3.1, 5, and 6. For 6 at the moment, make sure you set the pre-release just because it's not released yet. We're doing our .NET Publish, and then uploading all of our artifacts from all those different, the 4 different Azure Function projects. And then I've got my deploy job here, pulling down the artifacts and then deploying them. There's a GitHub action called Azure/Functions action. Now, something to call out about this action, the latest version is not 1.3.2, the latest version is 1.4. And the last time I checked that they hadn't updated that, but unfortunately there is a bug in that, which causes a whole lot of timeouts. The function still deploys, but rather than taking like 30 seconds, it takes maybe 2 or 3 minutes. So my recommendation is stick with this older version, and it's fine. Hopefully they'll fix that bug with the next release. It's hard to know that. There is an issue that's been raised. It hasn't been picked up yet, so I'm not sure what's going on there. Anyway, basically point each one of those at the directory where the files came down from the artifacts, and that's all we need to do, and that gets deployed. I'm just using a published profile that I've downloaded from the Azure portal. The other option, there is another way of using Azure Service Principal with a Azure login here as well to do that as well, depending on how you like to authenticate. And to see that, So we've got our build and deploy, and actually this one just deployed today. And so if I drill into deploy, there's all our deployments, and they're all depending on how much they've got to do. And so, yeah, even the .NET 5 and .NET 6, that's deployed in the same way. So that was all successful. So now we've got everything deployed. We might as well test everything. So first of all, I talked about the service bus. So all 4 of my Azure functions have got a subscription to a Azure Service Bus topic. And so we'll just confirm that that topic is there. And so we've got 4 subscriptions down the bottom here, and there's currently 0 messages there. So if I jump back over to my command line, I've got a program called send messages are written, and I'm just going to run that. That's going to post a message to that service bus topic. There we go. If I jump back here, oops, I didn't mean to click on that. Refresh, and one's already got it. So we'll see these counts go down as the functions processes. So .NET 5 Azure function was obviously raring to go and process that message already. And this is the sort of thing, especially in a demo where they're all a bit shy and they don't really want to do anything and they'd rather you go away and do something else. The other thing to be aware of, and I guess this relates to Azure Functions performance, is that if an Azure function has been used for a while, it will tend to go to sleep and it will take a while to warm up. If that's a problem, you want an Azure function to always be ready to go, then there's a different plan that you can choose that will provide that feature, but you obviously have to pay for that. There we go. We've had a few more kick in and do their work. We've got 1 to go. Come on, .NET 6 out of process. Yeah, I think we'll let him do it in his own time. He's obviously a little bit not wanting to do it in public. That's fine. All right. And so wrapping up, I've shown this evening how we've got Azure Functions and we can support .NET 5 and 6 and who knows, one day 7 or beyond. We can add support for OpenAPI to our Azure Functions, and then we can set up a CI/CD pipeline to deploy our Azure Functions really easily using Azure Pipelines or GitHub Actions. I've got a link here to the source code that I've used for the demo this evening. There's also a README in that repo, which contains a whole lot of links to useful references around Azure Functions. There's my blog as well.